Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking you through my top tips for beginner sewists. So I've been on my sewing journey for about the last 4.5 years, and over this time I've learned a lot of little tips and tricks that I wish I had known when I started sewing. So if you're new to sewing, then this video is perfect for you. So let's just dive right into it. So my first tip is going to help you choose the correct size when you're sewing up a sewing pattern. To choose the correct size for a pattern, it's a lot different than when you go shopping in a store. You obviously don't have the ability to try the pattern on before you sew it, and sizing on patterns is really different from ready-to-wear clothing sizes in the store. In addition to that, each pattern company has a different size chart, so you always need to compare your own measurements to the size chart on the sewing pattern. So if you've never measured yourself before, what you're going to need is a long, flexible measuring tape. Mine has one side that's in inches and one side that's in centimeters. So you're going to need to know your bust, waist, and hip measurements in order to choose the correct pattern size. So to start measuring yourself, you should ideally wear clothes that are form-fitting, and for your bust measurement, wear a bra that you tend to wear every day. To measure yourself, simply wrap the measuring tape around the area of your body that you'd like to measure. For your chest, make sure you're wearing a bra that you wear day to day, so just wear your usual undergarments, and make sure that the measuring tape stays level. So it can be helpful to look in a mirror and make sure that your measuring tape is level when you're doing this measurement, or get a friend to help you. And then once you know what your measurement is, you can simply record this and keep it on hand so that in the future when you're picking pattern sizes, you know your correct body measurements. So I'd also recommend to measure your waist and your hips as well. And like I mentioned, the outfit I'm wearing today isn't something I would take proper measurements in. I would recommend to wear a form-fitting outfit or just your undergarments. There's lots of tutorials available online on how to take a variety of body measurements. So if you're someone who struggles with finding the correct pattern size, a great place to start is to make sure that you know your body measurements well. My second tip for you is about pre-washing fabrics. So before you start on a sewing project, I always recommend that you wash your fabric first before you cut it out. And the main reason for this is that a lot of fabrics shrink significantly on their first wash. So you don't want to spend a lot of time and care sewing up a garment only to wash it for the first time and have it shrink, and then you can't even wear it anymore. Some fibers are more prone to shrinking than others. Cotton, wool, linen, and most natural fibers are more likely to shrink than synthetics like polyester or nylon, but every fabric is different. And I recommend to pre-wash your fabrics in the same manner that you plan to wash the finished garment. So for example, if you plan to wash your garment in hot water and throw it in the dryer, then make sure you pre-wash your fabric by washing it in hot water and throwing it in the dryer. But if you're planning on washing in cold water and hanging to dry, then I'd wash your fabric the same way before you start sewing. In addition to that, once you've pre-washed your fabric, in order to get the best finish, I'd recommend to iron your fabric or steam it so that it's relatively flat for when you go to cut out your pattern pieces. And this will just help you make sure that your cutting is as accurate as possible. The next tip I have for you is to cut out your fabric on the proper grain. So most fabrics have 3 types of grains. The lengthwise grain runs from one end of the fabric to the other, parallel to the selvage edges. And this is typically the grain that most pattern pieces will be cut out on, is that lengthwise grain. There's also a cross grain of the fabric which goes perpendicular to the selvage edges, so it runs between the selvage edges of a piece of fabric. And in some fabrics like knit fabrics, often the crosswise grain might have more stretch than the lengthwise grain. So this can be important to consider when you're cutting out your fabric pieces, because you want to know which direction you should be cutting them on. There is the third grain, the bias grain, and this runs at a 45-degree angle to the selvage lines. Typically, most fabrics have a bit more stretch along this grain, so garments that have been made out of fabric that's cut on the bias are usually a little bit stretchy, and they tend to hug the body in a really flattering way. Most pattern pieces should have an arrow on them showing you which way to place the piece when you're cutting out the fabric. Most of the time, this arrow should be placed along the lengthwise grain. But always read your pattern instructions just in case this should be placed on the bias or this should be placed on the crosswise grain. But typically most patterns have the arrow to show you where to put the piece on the lengthwise grain. So the next tip I have for you I think makes a big difference in the quality of your finished garments, and that is to finish and press your seam allowances at every step of your project. So when I say finish seam allowances, what I mean is using some sort of method, whether that's a stitch or pinking shears, to finish the edges of your seam to prevent them from unraveling. This is most important for woven fabrics, which are more prone to unraveling. Most types of knit fabrics don't unravel, but you still might want to finish your seams for a neater look. Typical methods for finishing seams can include a serger. So if you have a serger at home, you can use that to finish your seams. And sergers are nice because they trim and finish in one step. But if you're someone who only has a home sewing machine like me, you can still finish your seams on a home sewing machine using a zigzag stitch or a mock overlock stitch. If you'd prefer not to use a stitch to finish your seams, you can also use a special type of fabric scissors called pinking shears, which cut your fabric in very small zigzags, and this can prevent fabric from unraveling as well. Depending on the garment, you can finish your seams together, so the two pieces of fabric can be finished all in one and pressed to one side, or each piece of fabric can be finished first, and then you're able to press the seam open. And usually you'd press the seam open for a close-fitting garment, something that's hugging the body, or in tailoring applications when you have really bulky fabric, because if you were to press the seam allowances to one side, it might end up looking too bulky. And just like finishing the seam, pressing the seam at every step is really important for a neat finish, and I think this is a step that a lot of beginners skip because it is time intensive. And I have a little illustration of why this becomes so important. As you can see in this side-by-side example, the seam that I didn't press after sewing has a really messy look to it, and then when I go to attach another fabric to it, like I would when I was making a project, the seam doesn't lie flat, so then you also have a messy look at the next seam as well. And if you compare this to the project where I have pressed my seams at each step, you get a nice flat finish, and all of your pieces of fabric should line up very well when you've taken the time to finish your seams. If you're enjoying this video, please subscribe and press that notification bell. So the next tip I have for you is all about matching the correct fabric to the pattern. So this is something that I think a lot of beginners can struggle with because there's so many fabric options available. It can feel really overwhelming to know what type of fabric would work well for what project. So most pattern companies will give you suggestions on what type of fabric would work well with their patterns. So if it's a physical pattern you bought in an envelope, check the back of the envelope for suggested fabrics. But if you purchase the pattern online, you can look at the manufacturer's website or see if it came anywhere in the PDF, because most of the time they'll give you that information. The most important thing to remember is to use woven fabrics for patterns that are designed for woven fabrics and knit fabrics for patterns that are designed for knit fabrics. So the main difference between woven fabrics and knit fabrics are that woven fabrics are the result of weaving two sets of yarn or thread together. So if you look at this pattern close up on the left, you can see the weaving pattern there. And because of this, the resulting fabric will have very little stretch in either direction along the lengthwise grain or the widthwise grain, but there will be a little bit of stretch along the bias. If you contrast this to the knit fabric, which you see on the right, the knit fabric results from the interlocking yarn, which is knitted together. And this knit pattern in fabric very closely resembles the same types of knitting patterns that you see in sweaters. Because of these interlocking loops, knits will naturally have a little bit of stretch to them compared to woven fabrics. So if you sew up a pattern that's designed for some stretch in a fabric that has no stretch, you're probably not going to be able to get it on, the seams might rip, and you're just going to be really disappointed. So make sure that you have that sorted out. You can also consider the weight of the fabric that you're planning to use for your project. For example, a lightweight summer blouse would call for a thinner, sheer, lighter weight fabric than something like a pair of jeans, which is obviously a much heavier, stiffer fabric. So I'd recommend to go to your local fabric stores, spend some time looking at fabrics, touching them, feeling them, so you start to get more familiar with different types of fabrics and what you like and don't like when you're picking out fabrics. One other tip for knit fabrics would be always make sure you're using a knit that is stretchy enough. Usually the pattern manufacturer would have suggested that your fabric has a specific amount of stretch. Say it's 50%, 60%, 70%, and so on. Always make sure that you take that very seriously. I would not recommend using a fabric that is not stretchy enough. So make sure that if the pattern recommends 70% stretch on the cross grain, you test your fabric out to make sure it has that much stretch. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm going to put an article in the description box down below about how to determine the stretch percentage of your stretchy fabric. One other thing you might consider when choosing the correct fabric for a certain pattern would be to head over to Instagram and look at the hashtag for that specific pattern to see what other sewists have been using to make that specific pattern and see what they had success with. And if you like what they've done, then you could use something similar for your project. So now let's talk more about your sewing machine itself, because there's a few things you'll want to consider on here when you're starting your projects. The first thing would be to make sure that you have the correct stitch length and width selected. So the two basic types of stitches most sewers will use are a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. A straight stitch is good for most general applications, especially for woven fabrics and for projects that won't stretch. You wouldn't want to use a straight stitch for a project that needs to stretch because straight stitches have little to no ability to stretch. So if you try to stretch that seam line, it's likely that the stitch is just going to pop and break. So when you're sewing something that needs to stretch, a zigzag stitch is more ideal because it has stretch. Most modern sewing machines will have a variety of other options for stretch stitches. You might have a straight stretch stitch on your sewing machine. You might have a mock overlock stitch. So make sure you read your sewing machine's manual to understand what type of stitch you should be using for your project. Along with that, you might want to play with the length of the stitch. Usually you could use a longer stitch for applications like top stitching, for basting pieces of fabric together loosely, or for very bulky fabrics where they're not feeding through the machine very quickly. And you might want to use a shorter stitch for very fine fabrics like silk or a very sheer fabric like a cotton poplin. Next thing to consider on your machine would be the tension. So tension is something that I think takes a long time to fully understand. It's going to differ depending on your machine. If you test some stitches on your scrap of fabric, it can help you understand if the tension is correct. So the tension on your sewing machine is controlled by some tension discs. Every machine is a little bit different, but the overall idea is the same for all machines. The tension can be adjusted for both the top thread, which in this example is red, or the bottom thread, which in this example is green. However, most sewists will adjust the top thread tension. Ideally, most new sewists shouldn't have to readjust their bobbin thread too much, so I wouldn't recommend that you try this. In this example, in the top line of stitching, the top thread tension is too loose. The reason I can tell this is when I look at the back side of the fabric, I can see that the top red thread is showing on the back side of the fabric. In the middle two lines of stitching in this example, the tension is pretty much balanced. There should be none of the bobbin thread visible on the top line of stitching and none of the top thread visible on the bottom. The seam looks balanced and consistent throughout the length of the stitch. In the bottom row of stitching in this example, the top thread tension is too tight. I can tell that the top thread tension is too tight because in some spots along my stitch line, a little bit of the green bobbin thread is showing up on the top side of the fabric. In addition to this, the seam line looks a little bit wonky and uneven. Tension plays a big role in ensuring that your stitch lines are neat and tight from both the top and the bottom. So you need to make sure that your top thread and your bobbin thread look similar on both sides when you're done sewing. If the tension is incorrect, it'll mean that you'll have a wonky looking seam, the seam will be weak, and it will probably end up pulling apart. So tension is really, really important, and it can often be really frustrating because if your tension is wrong, you'll know it, your machine will let you know, your stitch line will look really wonky, the fabric won't feed correctly, or you'll have a host of other issues. So I'm also going to link some more information down below about how to adjust the tension settings of your machine. Along with that, the last tip kind of relating to your sewing machine is to make sure that you're using the right type of needle for your project. So sewing machine needles come in different sizes from smaller to larger, which refers to the thickness of the needle. And thinner needles are good for lighter weight fabrics. Again, think summery tops, sheer fabrics, whereas thicker needles are more useful for heavier weight fabrics, think like a heavy denim. And there are also different kinds of needles, and they differ by how sharp or the shape of their tip, which is hard to see with the naked eye. So a standard all-purpose needle is great for a variety of uses like woven fabrics. A ballpoint needle has a rounded tip, and it's useful for sewing knit fabrics. The idea is that the ballpoint needle doesn't actually pierce the fabric. It more so slips between little holes in the knit, so it will help to avoid damaging your knit fabrics. There are also some more specialty needles available on the market, like twin needles, which can be useful for top stitching, super stretch needles, which are designed for making things out of extremely stretchy fabrics, such as activewear, denim needles, which are designed for working with denim, top stitching needles, which are useful when you're doing top stitching, as well as microtex needles, which are super sharp and are very useful when you're working with fine fabrics, think of silk. The other thing you have to remember is to always switch out your needle when it's becoming dull. If you notice problems like your machine is skipping stitches, that's a really good indication that it's time to change the needle in your machine. And keep up with this because it can make a big difference to the quality of your project. So again, I'm going to link some more information about sewing machine needles in the description box below if you want to learn more. Another step that some new sewers might skip would be stay stitching and understitching. Stay stitching refers to stitching within the seam allowance, usually around curved seams, before you even sew up the garment. And this step might seem like a waste of time, but curved or rounded seams are really prone to stretching out. So if you're working with a very fine fabric with a curved seam, almost the moment you lift it up, it's going to start to stretch out and warp. And then later on in your project, when you're trying to sew curved seams together, it's going to seem like they're not going to fit properly because your fabric has stretched out. It's often the very first thing you do in a project right after you've cut out the pattern pieces. I recommend to never to skip this step. I've skipped it a few times in the past, and I always end up having a lot of trouble with my curved seams because it's stretched out so much that they don't fit nicely together anymore. Similarly to that, I would also not skip understitching. Understitching is a line of stitches that go through one part of your main fabric as well as the seam allowance. It's a small line of stitches that attaches the lining or the facing to the seam allowance. Usually you'd see understitching on the inside of a neckline seam that either has a lining or a facing. It's there to help prevent the facing or the lining from flipping out. You can't see it from the right side. It has some uses in other applications too. It's not just for necklines, but that might be where you see it most often if you're a new sewer. Again, I wouldn't skip this step. If you do, you might find that your facing and lining are constantly bagging out to the front. It's going to look messy, and you already put in a lot of hard work to your garment. So just take the extra minute to sew that line of understitching and you'll be happy you did. Last but not least, when I was a new sewist, I felt confused about where I could find reliable information to help me learn how to sew. Since you're already here on YouTube, I'm assuming you know that YouTube has hundreds of helpful tutorials for things like setting up your machine, all the way to custom and detailed tailoring techniques. So you can find a lot of information on YouTube. But outside of YouTube, I wanted to mention a few more resources that I thought you might find helpful if you are new to sewing. So Seamwork is a company that makes sewing patterns, but they also make videos, text tutorials, blog posts, all about sewing technique and sewing knowledge. So they're a great resource. You can check out their website if you're interested. Certain pattern companies like Megan Nielsen, Closet Core, Helen's Closet, and many others, just to name a few, also have very detailed blogs. They'll give you tips about basic techniques as well as how to sew their patterns step by step. So if you find yourself needing some more information, those are great resources as well. If you're looking for information about patterns, then you really can't do better than the website Pattern Reviews Online. This website has a little bit of an older look to it, but don't be fooled. It's a wealth of information where you can review sewing patterns. Others can read your review and comment. And many sewing patterns have multiple multiple reviews, including pictures and detailed information. So if you're looking to hear what other people thought about a certain pattern before you start to make it, make sure to check out the reviews on patternreview.com. I'm going to link them down below. Of course, there's still tons of people out there who like to share sewing information on blogs. So if you're someone who loves to read blogs, I would recommend that you check out some sewing blogs to get your information from there. And another great resource is Instagram. Many pattern companies associate a hashtag with their brand or their specific patterns. So often you can search a hashtag and then look through all of the posts that come up. So you can get inspired by seeing what other people have made with that pattern. Often people will provide information about sizing, their measurements, any modifications they made, the type of fabric they chose, and lots more. So if you're someone who loves to be on Instagram, you definitely have to get involved with the sewing community there because you'll find it's a really fun place to be. Okay guys, so that was all of my tips for beginner sewists. When I was putting together this video, there were so many other things that came to mind. So in the future, I might do a more in-depth video or series all about tips for beginner sewists, but I hope this video was helpful to you if you're someone who's new to sewing, because these are some of the things that I didn't understand when I started sewing, and I wish I had known then what I know now. So if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like sewing videos, please subscribe to my channel. I have lots of sewing related content coming up and I don't want you to miss out. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.